story. In my case, I had a little band called the McCoys.
Yeah.
And we backed up. We were playing often in a little place in Dayton, Ohio. We'd gotten well known enough in our area. We were rocking and bopping and getting the breaks, like it said. And we backed up a band called the Strangeloves one night. They came through town. They had a big hit, I Want Candy, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-ba-dum, bum. And they pretended to be three sheep herders from Australia. They were Miles, Niles, and Giles Strange was their names. Well, in reality, they were really Jerry Goldstein, Richie Gotterer, and Bob Feldman from New York City. Three young Jewish producers and writers. They had just produced the first big hit for Bang Records, My Boyfriend's Back. Remember that one? That was their record. And the president of the label was this guy named Bert Burns. And Bert Burns won a Grammy a couple of years ago for being this big successful songwriter, entrepreneur in the record business. He was the president of Bang Records. In fact, Bang actually stands for Bert, Amit, Nesui, and Gerald, B-A-N-G. These are Bert Burns, Amit Erdogan, Nesui Erdogan, and Jerry Wexler. Some of the biggest names, most powerful names at that time in show business. And they'd given this little label to Bert Burns as their little offshoot so they could cheat people, basically, cheat artists, and sell a lot of records. So Bert had this song that he had written called, and that's a questionable thing too about whether he wrote it. We won't even go too much. I don't have enough time to go into all the details today. But he had written a song called My Girl Sloopy, which was #1 in all the black charts by a band called The Vibrations in 1964. And so he had the idea, okay, you three guys, Feldman, Goldstein, and Gotterer, you're going to go out on tour now, and you're going to promote your song, I Want Candy. But while you're out there on tour, see, the thing is, I got my first guitar in 1956, which I call the year of Elvis. And then I got our first hit in 1965, which I call the year of the Beatles. So I'm kind of hot-wired to be a rock and roller. And that's exactly what they told these guys to look for. They said, while you're out there on the road promoting I Want Candy, we want you to look for a band that might, young guys, 4 young white guys that look like the Beatles. Because what they did in those days was they'd take the songs from the black charts and then they'd do them with a white guy like Pat Boone, for instance, who's famous for doing that. And they'd have a much more selling record with the white audience. So he thought, well, this record by the Vibrations, My Girl Sloopy, if we can find 4 guys that look like the Beatles, because this is the year of the Beatles, if we can find 4 young guys that look like the Beatles, we can take advantage of them and we can record them and do this song, My Girl Sloopy, and it'll be huge. So they had actually gone out on that tour. The Strangeloves were out there looking for that band. They didn't find them. Fortunately, we were the last show on their tour, and we didn't know anything about this backstory, but we had coincidentally bought our Beatle suits that day. So there we were, in our Beatle suits, on the last show of the tour. And we, as a band, even though we were little kids, we listened to WLAC in Nashville because they played all the blues stuff. And we liked blues, and we liked soul, and we liked all kinds of music. We were a pretty good little band. So they said, do you guys, in our sound check that day, they said, do you guys know the song My Girl Sloopy? And we said, do we know that song? We love that song. Sure we know that song. So we played the My Girl Sloopy with them at their show that night. And they said, and they went back in the dressing room and thought, wow, we've struck gold here. We found exactly what we were looking for. So they brought us back into the dressing room and they said, would you guys like to come back to New York City tomorrow and record My Girl Sloopy? Well, I looked over at my dad, who was our road manager, and I said, Dad, what do you think? And he said, my vacation starts tomorrow. So we did that. We went back to New York City, followed those guys in their car all the way back, recorded the basic track to Hang On Sloopy, which it became, and a few days later recorded the vocals. They whipped that thing out there as fast as they could, and just the week before it was supposed to be released, they received a 45 in the mail, and it was of a band called Little Caesar and the Consoles. They were from Canada, and they had just released My Girl Sloopy. So, Bert, Amit, Nesui, and Gerald, these are the tough guys of the record business. So they said, we got to kick this thing into high gear. We want all those guys to go to all the radio stations in the United States and do whatever it takes. And that is literally, I mean, there have been people carried out of offices with broken legs and things like that. Literally, they said, they're not going to play Little Caesars. They're going to play the McCoys version, which I had suggested. We don't say My Girl Sloopy. We say Hang On Sloopy. Why don't we call it Hang On Sloopy? So that was my suggestion at the time. So they said, you're going to play Hang On Sloopy. So the point is, hits sometimes kind of take a while to creep up the charts. But because of this extenuating circumstance of Little Caesar and the Consoles, they were pushed into high gear, and the McCoys version of Hang On Sloopy went like right up to the top. So within literally weeks, I mean a couple months at the most, it was #1. I turned on TV. In those days, Huntley Brinkley was the big, you'd turn on an old style TV and you'd watch Huntley Brinkley News. And Huntley Brinkley said, today, the Russians have decided to play rock and roll for the proletariat. And they had a picture on the screen of a building in Moscow and a little gray speaker cabinet that they used to have, those folded horn things. And it was blasting Hang On Sloopy, the first song they played in Moscow for the proletariat. Wow. So it's pretty much like that story. I told you that, you know, we just were found at the right moment, but it was so big. The song was so successful, they said, how are we going to follow it? What song? I mean, Hang On Sloopy, we don't... That's pretty straight ahead, a simple little song. And it had that little drum thing, boom, 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 boom. So they said, how are we going to follow it? So they suggested that we do the song Fever. And the intro to Fever went like this. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, so it did pretty well. Patty Page, I believe, did a really big, successful version. Little Willie John, I believe, wrote it. But ours was the most successful version of the song. It sold more than any of those people. So it was a pretty big hit. So people call us a one-hit wonder. Hey, think again. We had at least 2. And we followed it with... Come on, let's go, little darling. Come on and show me that you love me. Come on, let's go again and again and again and again. Which was by Richie Valens originally. But once again, the McCoys version outsold Richie Valens. That was 3 top 10 hits in a row. So you can't accuse us of being one-hit wonders. But what they did was, then they started throwing these songs at us. Every single song sounded like that. Every single song was this. And like I told you guys, we thought we were cool. We liked the blues. We liked jazz. We liked all kinds of music. And you know, all of a sudden we're going like, hey, this is getting kind of corny, you know. And all of a sudden there was a new batch of bands that came out. They called it bubblegum music, actually, at the time. So we were being characterized all of a sudden as part of the bubblegum music generation. That was like, oh no! To us, I mean, we were going, hey, this can't go. This ain't going to, this dog don't fight that way. So we decided to just, we had these powerful, you know, managers and the powerful record company and all these power structure behind us. We said, well, we're tired of this. We're just going to, we have an opportunity to leave our contract. We're just going to leave you guys. We're going to go out on our own. Not a good idea. But we did it, nonetheless. So we did. We record company found us, Mercury Records, said we'll sign you guys. So we were signed to Mercury Records, and we did a couple of albums. One was called Infinite McCoys, and one was called, I don't even remember. But the bottom line, Human Ball, it was called. And the collectors bring those things up for me to sign sometimes. They're out there, Infinite McCoys and Human Ball. But they had some strange music on them, because we wanted to break out of that bubblegum image. So we did all the strangest music you guys ever heard. It was psychedelic, and it was jazzy, and it was just from all points of the blues. We had some blues on there. And we were not going very far, very quick with that stuff. But luckily, we lived right in Manhattan, and just about 3 blocks from where I lived, there was a little club called The Scene, Steve Paul's The Scene. And it became a very, very famous club in rock and roll history because all the artists, those days you could fly out and do a concert and fly back to New York City and it'd still be like 11, 12 o'clock. And they could go down to The Scene till 4 a.m. And jam, basically. So we stumbled on this place. Even as little kids, they let us in. And we got up and jammed. And the next thing you know, they were having us play all the time. We became like the house band there at The Scene. And at The Scene, even though Mercury Records, we weren't doing much there, but at The Scene, we played some of this stuff from, here, I'll play you a little bit of one of the songs. This is a song that we were playing at that time at The Scene, and it was from one of those Mercury Records. The sunrise in the sky. Daybreak. And now at last I see the... I don't remember the rest of it. Well, you guys got the idea. It was, you know, it wasn't that same old bubblegum stuff was the point. And down there at The Scene, we had the opportunity to, I got to know Jimi Hendrix. I jammed with Jimi Hendrix many times at The Scene. He became a friend. My guitars were stolen one night from The Scene, and Jimmy loaned me his guitars to use for our next gig. He said, you're going to have to turn them over and restring them, but here, you know, you need some guitars, take these. So he loaned me a couple guitars to play. Became good friends with Jimmy. I watched him mix all along the watchtower at the record plant. I stood right behind the console. It was a great memory for me. But the time went on, and there at the scene, we got to know Steve Paul, who was the owner of the scene, and he decided he wanted to be a manager. He said, I want to manage. I want to get in this record business and manage people. So he had opened up the latest issue of Rolling Stone, and he saw in Rolling Stone that it said, B.B. King says, I found the best blues guitar player ever. And he's this albino guy, lives in Texas, named Johnny Winter. Yeah. So Steve said, I'm going to find that guy. So he actually took a plane, just not having a clue where he was going or anything, flew to, who knows, Houston or Dallas or somewhere, and got off the plane and just started asking questions. Where can I find this guy, Johnny Winter? And he tracked him down. He tracked him down. He brought him back to New York City, became his manager, signed him to the biggest record contract that had ever been signed at that time. Pretty amazing feat by itself. And through that experience, I got to meet Johnny down there at the scene. And Steve Paul said, you know, Johnny, these records that we're getting paid tons of money for really aren't selling quite as many as the record company would like to justify this output of money. So how can we fix that? And Steve said, well, what we got to do is we got to get rid of your band. He said, those two guys are just kind of nondescript. And he said, what we need is you need to play more rock and roll with your blues. You can still play the blues, but you need to play some more rock and roll. And he said, I got a great idea. He said, these guys called the McCoys, they might look young to you, but they're pretty good. And I think they'd be a great addition. They, you know, you guys together would be a great band. Johnny goes, I don't know about that idea. That sounds pretty freaky to me. So Steve said, well, I'll do this. They're playing at this club next week in Manhattan. I'll take you down to hear them play and make your mind up. See what you think. Well, Johnny thought, I don't know if I'm going to be able to fairly judge this because I'm already saying this ain't going to work. So he said, what I'll do, I'll bring my brother, who I've just brought to New York with me. I'll bring Edgar Winter with me. And I'll let Edgar make the decision. So they actually did. They came down to this little club where the McCoys were playing. And they're sitting right there at this little table right there. And we played our set. And Johnny said, well, what do you think, Edgar? And Edgar said, I like the idea. He said, I think it'd be pretty cool. So they decided at that moment that we would be a band. Basically, Johnny Winter and the McCoys. But the record company said, well, you know the McCoys. They still got that bubblegum thing hanging on that name, the McCoys. So I don't know. We got to have a different name. So they kept thinking, and they couldn't come up with a name. And finally they said, how about if we just go Johnny Winter and? Mm-hmm. So Johnny Winter and was really Johnny Winter and the McCoys. They were just afraid to say it. Literally, you know. So Johnny Winter and became our band, and I had a great time playing with Johnny over the years, really. He was fabulous. One of the greatest blues guitar players ever. The best slide guitar player I've ever heard at his style. When they talk about injustices at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Johnny Winter should be in there.
Hallelujah.
But through that experience, playing with Johnny, I got to play with Edgar, because Edgar would come out sometimes and play with Johnny. In fact, that brings me to the next little story I'm going to tell you. Johnny and Edgar were albinos. The parents were told after Johnny, they were nervous about having another kid. They said, you know, I don't know, will we have another albino? And the doctors assured them, no, you won't. That'll never happen. That doesn't happen, you know. And in fact, they went ahead and had their next son, Edgar, and he is actually on the scale of albinism. He's more of an albino than Johnny. So, the two of them, as little kids, just became known as that little white kid. In other words, there wasn't two of them to the other kids. They just talk about him, that little white kid, you know, those winters, that little white kid. So both of them had to develop different personalities to be individual people. And Edgar became kind of the jazzy, nerdy kind of guy that he is. And Johnny became the real blues, rough guy that he is. And they would do gigs, both of them. They had little bands and stuff. Johnny actually is people somehow connotate then as Edgar being smarter than Johnny. But in reality, Edgar's first album called Entrance, Johnny wrote all the lyrics to the whole album. And a lot of people don't know that. So Johnny was a very smart guy. But at any rate, they would do their gigs. Edgar would do his jazzy stuff and have just a few people show up. Johnny would do his bluesy, rocky stuff and have pack the club. So in order to give Edgar a little more exposure, he'd bring him out. He'd bring him out and play and say, Edgar, come on up and play. Show these people what you can do, little brother. And Edgar developed this song he called the double drum solo. And in the double drum solo, he'd come out and play it with Johnny's band at these clubs, and he'd get to play drums and sax and keyboards and everything that he does on the double drum solo. Now, Edgar likes to go out and tell people that he wrote the song Frankenstein because he wanted an outlet for that portable keyboard. Mm-hmm. He says he invented the strap-on, is what he says. Kind of funny. But the truth is, he didn't write the song for the strap-on. He was playing that song their whole lives. And the double drum solo was what it was called. So I went on from Johnny, and I produced some Edgar Winter records. I produced the record They Only Come Out at Night. In fact, I produced all of Johnny and Edgar's records that were successful, the really gold and platinum stuff. And the ones that weren't gold or platinum were the ones that I didn't produce, coincidentally. But at any rate, on the album, They Only Come Out at Night, we had a good selection of songs. And my co-worker, the engineer, the famous producer, Bill Simzik, that produced the Eagles, all the big stuff for a lot of stuff. Bill Simzik is a famous producer, engineer. So he became the engineer on my project, and he was our helper there in that capacity. And we all said, this is going to be a cool album. But that one song, we're really looking forward to doing that one song, that double drum solo. Double drum solo song, we want to do that one. Well, just to show you how record companies work, first thing they did was they came in the first session and said, you know, that one song doesn't seem to fit on this record. So we like the rest of the record, but we'd like you not to do that one song, the double drum solo. Well, Bill Simzik and I looked at each other and said, that's the best song on the record to us. So we're going to do it anyway. So we did it, and Edgar likes to do things long. He stretches things out forever. He loves that. He loves to jam and play, and it's great. But the song, the double drum solo, was like a half an hour long. I mean, close to it, really. So the first job was I had to edit it. In those days, we had 2-inch tape, and when you'd cut, you'd actually splice the tape. It wasn't like nowadays. Now we got it easy in the digital world. Those days, we had to take out a razor and actually cut the tape. Very dangerous prospect. And so luckily we had a guy, Bill Simzik, who was one of the best at doing that in the world. So we edited the whole thing, and pretty much what I did was took every section of the song and cut it in half, took out half, and we'd hang those pieces of tape that we took out along the wall, and then we'd play the thing back, and you'd watch all these pieces of tape go past, and it was kind of, we go, wow, you cut this baby up pretty good. But the bottom line was, it still wasn't short enough, because it was a long song. So we did it again. We went back into all those sections and cut them in half again. So now when you'd watch the tape play, you'd see even more splices. Tape, 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 as the thing played. So when we finally got it cut down to size, we were sitting there watching it, and I said, you know, this looks like the Frankenstein monster. Because they didn't have a title for it yet. This looks like the Frankenstein monster here. And I think it was Chuck Ruff, our drummer, that said, well, maybe just Frankenstein. Now, Edgar has a little different version of that story. He says Chuck actually said maybe Frankenstein, and he said whatever. He said, she said, they said whatever. But my memory says that I looking at this thing said it should be the Frankenstein monster, and Chuck said Frankenstein, and the rest is history. Huge. Number one. Instant number one. In fact, the record company released Free Ride first, thinking that was going to be the hit. Free Ride, they released it later, and it became a hit. But when they released it first, it didn't sail. So they released Frankenstein, and it came out and became a big, huge hit. Now, then over the years, I loved playing with Edgar. The whole thing with Edgar is, I told the story, I think, in the concert. We used to get these tapes every week in the mail,